Chairwoman, thank you very much. Let me start by saying a personal word. I really follow up on my friend's Mustapha Nabli yesterday's few words. I'd like to welcome you in Tunis and Tunisia. This is a special time for us, and we appreciate that we are here. And I would like to thank you all for having made it, having selected to be here, and having selected to confront the forces of darkness who try to disrupt what we do. The forces of darkness, what they want to destroy democracy, and they want to destroy development. They don't believe in democracy, they want to, so their project is antinomic. It's completely the opposite of what we want to do. And your presence here is a message that they cannot succeed. They will fail, and we promise you as Tunisians that we make them fail. Tunisia will succeed in our economy. So this is my initial word. Coming to our session, and democracy and economic development. This is a broad topic. We had a discussion yesterday, and Tab has made a great presentation earlier. What I would like to do is really go back and start from a different perspective. I remember when the uprisings in Tunisia took place, and we were in this euphoric phase where we were going into democratic development. That was really the euphoric area of the early 2011. The big message that was coming out of the debates, and I would differ with Tara, people were talking about the impact of democracy on development and on economic growth, early on, from very early on. But it was a very simplistic and erroneous way of thinking about it. There was this idea that was developed that if we get democracy, we are going to make it in terms of economic development. We have a 2 percentage points of dividend, growth dividend by democracy. So if we just succeed, we'll get growth rates to go from 4.5 to 6.5% or 7%. Ipso facto. That was the message. And people did not realize that the world doesn't work like that. And that's a mistaken way of understanding what we know about democracy and development. And people tend to confuse democracy and good governance. Actually, the literature, and I think, is very ambiguous on, as you were saying, about the impact of democracy and democratic institutions on growth. But there is a lot of empirical evidence which shows that this good governance is good for growth. So ipso facto, we are thinking that democracy will produce good governance and therefore will produce better growth rates. And there is nothing in the literature which really is supportive of this evidence. So that's my starting point. So this being said, and I have to see what is the here. Okay. I think there is a lot of confusion, as Sarah said, there is a lot of confusion about understanding how democracy and development interact and how democracy impacts development and vice versa and so on. And this is the broad picture I understand. Really, the impact of democracy and development depends on the interaction of 4 dimensions or 4 factors. One is the structural factors, and I think that's the conclusion of Tara. Says that's all that matters. What Tara was telling us is that really all that matters is the structural factors. Is the level of development, is all the other things you need to talk about, whether it's endowments, inequality, history, the development of urban versus rural, and so on. So this is really what matters. The rest doesn't matter. I will argue that the rest doesn't matter. So I will take a different point of view. So I'm not going to talk about the first dimensions, structural factors. It's not that they don't matter, but what I would say that the rest matters as well. So I focus on the other three dimensions, and really, when the discussion about the impact of democracy and development takes place, really people, usually research, take one of these dimensions and then takes it, and then tries. While we know it's really the interactions of these three factors together: the forms of democracy, the complementary institutions of democracy, because democracy, democratic institutions don't work in a vacuum. They work in interaction with other institutions. And we tend to and I try to focus on that point, that really what exists besides democracy matters for the success of democracy and its impact on development. And we don't forget also that the stage of democracy matters. Whether we are at the transition phase, democratism, whether we are at an emerging democracy, or whether we are at an established democracy, this matters. And in the literature, we tend to lump them together. And even in the cross-section, work, we put emerging democracies, transition democracy, established democracy, and then we put it all together and try to figure out what's the impact. And we don't see that really there are differential effects depending on which stage of democracy you are. So that's what I will try to argue and I will try to develop. And I will do that by addressing three questions. And the first one, it's which democratic institutions or forms of democracy are more supportive of inclusive development? This is really Tarek's discussion, and I will not spend much time on this. But I would say one thing. In that discussion, we always forget the other three dimensions. Whether it's the complementary institutions or whether it's the stage of democracy, we forget about that. And therefore, some of the findings are really not very conclusive because we forget that. I'm not going to dispense, I think Tarek talked eloquently about these distinctions about forms of democracy, whether it's presidential versus parliamentarian, proportional representation versus majoritarian, consensual versus majoritarian, and so on. There's a wide body of literature on this and has been eloquently discussed. My main, what I take from this literature is a few major implications. The broad tendency of the literature is a lot of debates, and it's not very conclusive. But broadly speaking, democratic regimes which are more consensual tend to have a better grading in terms of success in achieving better growth outcomes and development outcomes. Consensual because they are less majoritarian and more proportional, and more parliamentarian than presidential. They tend to favor the developmental outcomes and inclusive development, as it were. Such regimes tend to produce more equality, they're more inclusive, they redistribute more, and generate eventually in the long term more economic growth. Even though, and there is one piece of evidence which is, I think, Person and Tabellini, who show that actually in transition, and that's the importance of transition versus established, in transition democracies, actually parliamentary systems achieve less good outcomes in terms of growth than presidential systems. In the long run, parliamentary systems may be superior, but in the short term, in transition phases, they may be more costly in terms of economic growth. I think even they quantify, they say it's 1.5% points of growth less during transition. So what are the implications for the Arab countries in transition? And I think here I'm not going to, I think Tarek discussed this, but I would like to point one thing in terms of, I wouldn't say opposing the view of Tarek, because many of the things you say are right, but I think you forgot one point. Because you focused on the proportional representation of the parliament, you forgot the presidential part.
I left it out. I wrote a whole thing about that.
And I think one of the features of the institutions that were put in place in the transition phase in Tunisia, they stripped the presidential powers completely. We had a system where it was quasi-fully parliamentary. during that transition phase. So the president had no power at all, almost no power, which meant that we could not have a Morsi sticking to his job and refusing to make any concessions. And I think that's important. Now, is that the result of any underlying structural factors? I'm not sure. I think this is a result of the choice that was made of institutions because, structure if you like, because people were reacting to the excesses of the presidential system from before. So it has a historical perspective, if you like. But nevertheless, it was an institutional choice. It was a conscious choice, institutional choice on that. And therefore, the combination of this proportional representation and the weak presidential system made that the presidential system was forced to be more consensual than the presidential, more presidential and less parliamentary in Egypt, which was less, even though all of the factors that you mentioned. Which means that this consensual, more proportional representation is really important to pursue and preserve for the long term, even though, as I said, this could tell us that in Tunisia, in the short term, maybe there is going to be cost to that. And we are seeing it. The parliamentary system now is not producing quick decisions, is not producing quick reforms, is not producing the action that are needed to reinvigorate growth and development at this stage. So that's the first, and I'm not going to say more of this. So I want to go to the question 2, and I think it's more important from my perspective. Are there preconditions for democratization when it takes place to lead to good governance and better economic outcomes? So the question is not whether democracy is so focused on the complementary institutions of democracy. Because we know from the experience of developed countries, if you have all the good institutions in place, democracy and all of the complementary institutions in place, we have a developed society, right? We know in that case we'll have good economic outcomes. But we know also that no developing country starts from that place. Any developing country starts with democratization in a position where many institutions, complementary institutions, are not present. So the question is, do we know which ones are the significant ones, the critical ones that should be, if they were present, will make democracy succeed better and lead to better economic outcomes? So the focus is not on democracy itself, on democratic accountability institutions and the details of the forms of it, but what comes with it, whether it's important and what's significant. Now, there has been a lot of debate. What are the important complementary institutions? Which ones should we focus on? A lot of literature on that. My reading is that the focus has been on two major types of institutions. One is the state, the nature of the state, and one is the rule of law. And this comes out in many, this is the Fukuyama kind of approach, or others. Peter Norris and all of this. So they will focus on these two. What do we mean by modern and capable state? We mean a state which has a relative autonomy with respect to the politicians' political powers. A state which is impersonal, where meritocracy and competence are prevalent. A state which has an eye on the long term and not only on the short term as the political system politicians do. Such a state is important for the success of democracy. The other part is rules and institutions which achieve rule of law, means applying the law to everybody, including the powers to be and those in power. These turn out to be an important institutions. So what do we know about that? How did their presence or absence affect the success of democracy and achieving development? Fukuyama argues in his book of last year that in many countries which experience democratization, while there was good state capacity pre-existent, they were successful in achieving development. This is the case of the 19th century, whether it was in France or whether it was the experience of Prussia and Germany, and whether some of the northern countries, as well as the experience of Japan and others. When democratization took place in those countries, there was a pre-existing good state capability. And therefore, it was easy to build on that, and democratization was successful, first of all, and then it achieved development. By the way, the experience shows, and these are lessons that really, in these countries, growth started before democracy, actually. It was the state capability or the rule of law and their presence, the institutions, their presence, which was conducive to growth and development in the first place. And democracy came after and then reinforced and then allowed more inclusive development afterwards. That is so the role of the state, if it were pre-existent, if it was strong, then this is a good conducive impact on development of democracy as well on its success. Now, how about the cases where this was not present? If you have countries and experiences where democratization starts, where the state doesn't have these features that we talked about, what happens? Now, the empirical evidence shows that it goes all over the place. It goes all over the place. You can have experiences where democratization succeeds and they achieve better economic outcomes, and you have the opposite. And the most interesting case, example, and here I cite Fukuyama again, is the US. When democratization started in the US in the early 19th century, there was no good state capability, unlike what the case in Germany or in other countries. And what happened? Two things happened in the experience of the United States in the 19th century. One is that because of the pre-existence of rule of law, growth was achieved, and there was growth and dynamism and development and so on. But the state and the political system was completely messed up. Clientelistic, corruption, everything that you know in developing countries. The US went through that. The United States has a political system full of corruption, clientelistic, and all of that. And it was not until the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, that they built a state which was what we know in terms of modern state. And this is extremely important for developing countries to learn from. So the main point here is that really we have to pay attention to complementary institutions. And it turns out, according to my reading of the evidence, that state capability is critical, is central to any experience of democratization. So, I don't know how much time I have. 5 minutes? Yeah. So, what does it mean for us in developing countries and the Arab countries now? Let's take a look. This is a graph which shows ratings and index of state. It's called government effectiveness. This is worldwide governance indicators from the World Bank Group, which shows in 2000, the evolution from 2000 to 2012, an index of state government or state effectiveness, state capability. You see that, and the index goes from minus 2.5 to plus 2.5. It's a very complicated process. It doesn't matter really. So you see, all of the Arab countries except Tunisia started from very negative levels of state capability. Whether it's Egypt, whether it's Libya, and I'm putting here the so-called Arab Spring, Yemen, and then I'm putting Algeria, and I'm putting some comparator countries like Turkey, Chile, China, and Spain. What does this tell us? It tells us when the Arab Spring started. Most of the Arab countries start from very weak levels of state capability. And therefore, the chances of success of democratization was very, very unlikely. Only Tunisia had a chance because there was some relatively good state capability to start with. Even though, as the figures show, this was deteriorating already from 2000, 2010, 2011, 12. Things were getting worse, they're not getting any better. But still, Tunisia had a better chance because the pre-existing conditions of state capability were better than in other countries. You can see here that Libya had no chance whatever to get any success in democratization. And you can generalize that for other countries. So Tunisia had a chance. But this sense is not so strong. It's not very, very strong because the level of state capability was still weak and was getting worse. So my main point here is that really the state capability, one of the main lessons from this literature is that focusing on state capability is really critical during the state of democratic transition and in building democracy and the impact of democracy on economic growth. Third question. Third question is, okay, suppose that you don't have good state capability, you start from bad state, and then you decide to undertake to go on the journey of democratization. The question is, under what conditions can democratization spur the development of better governance and better institutions, state capability, rule of law, and therefore lead to better government? This is really the actual policy question that we need to address. I have to say that really this is the most critical, the most important, but unfortunately the literature is still weak on this. We don't have much to go on. So the only thing I could capture is, again, from Fukuyama's book, where he goes and tells us the story of what happened in Britain and the US when the British system, by the way, democratization was before state capability. The state capability was very weak, and the system was patronage, was corruption in the UK in the 18th century and the 19th century. So, but what happened is that these two countries were able to reform their state very quickly, and therefore, after democratization, to build a state and then to reap the benefits of that. So what do we learn from these experiences? What happened is that in Britain, the reform of the state was very rapid and very quick in the 1850s. In the US, it took much longer, about 3 or 4 decades from 1880s to the early 1820s and 30s. So what I'm trying to put here is just what do we learn from these experiences? A number of lessons, 3 lessons that I put forward here. First, that in some cases, Britain was very successful in achieving the reform of state in a decade. They introduced the main reforms of the state to make it impersonal, bureaucratic, and all of the features that we like in a modern state, and change completely their state apparatus. Major reforms were completed. However, in some other countries like US, it took much longer, it took 2 or 3 generations to do it. But the main lessons from that is that the role of political leadership was critical in achieving that change, that institutional change was successful. The second lesson is that in those countries, in those experiences, the pre-existing process of economic modernization was critical in the success of this process. The industrialization that was taking place in Britain, as well as the US, made that there was creation of a middle class which demanded the reform of the state, which did not like the corruption that was pre-existing, did not like the political system which was clientelistic and so on, and it had a strong demand for a better government, a better state, more meritocratic, and less corrupt than it was. And the existence of that middle class was critical in the success. And the existence of coalitions that pushed for that was critical in eventually their success. The third lesson, which is maybe more less solid, if you like, is the existence of strong national identity was very critical in many cases in the success of development of a state capacity and a state which is democratic and supportive of development. Now this is maybe Gerard will tell us about this because he's going to tell us about culture and this. So what implications for Arab countries and democratization? Again, the critical priority for building and strengthening state institutions were not clientelistic and responsive to the needs of the middle class. So the institutions have to be of the state, have to be responsive to the needs of the middle class, because the middle class will be the critical, force which will protect and support the democratic process and make it succeed. The second lesson is that if there is political will, if we do it right, we can achieve it relatively quickly. It's not something that you say is going to take half a century to do. Actually, we can do it. The third lesson is that preserving and strengthening the middle class during that process is critical for its success. Because if you have a process whereby the middle class is being destroyed and being weakened, then you are unlikely to build your democracy and unlikely to have a successful democratic process and to achieve the inclusive development that we want. And finally, ensuring that national identity is strengthened, is consolidated, and fighting any attempts to weaken it. And this brings me to full circle to my earlier remarks about what the terrorists are trying to do is to destroy national identity. And therefore, that's when I say they're trying to destroy democracy, not only directly, but indirectly as well. Because they don't believe in national identity, they want to destroy, they have an identity which I don't know where it is, comes from, and I think this is part of the story. And building on that national identity and strengthening it is critical for the success of democracy and of the impact of democratic processes on development. So, in conclusion, the main points I would say that really I would like to, what I'm suggesting, that maybe the question we ask is not there's some concepts of democracy and how do we build the whole institutional setup of democracy, democratic as well as other institutions, to make them work for democracy better and to work for development better, so that we can achieve both objectives. Because what we need today, the way I see it, at least for Tunisia, is how it is that we can build the democratic institution and democratic process, because we value them on their own, but also how do they make them work for development, because we want democracy with development and not democracy only, and we don't want development without democracy, because we have seen the impact of a process which is autocratic, dictatorship, and without democracy is also not something that we value. And therefore, how we can have these two dimensions work together. And there's some pointers. So what I try to say is that the literature, the experiences tell us some indications where we should focus our attention and maybe work more on these issues as we go forward. Thank you very much.